Check, check, 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 1 2 1 2 1 1 check 1 2 1 2 check 1 2 1 2 1 1 1 2 1 check 1 2 2 yeah, nice man. Check, check 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 wet. Just checking my microphone to make sure that we inside. Check 1 2 1 2 1 1 1 2 1. Check 1 2 2. Yeah, nice one. Check check 1 2 1 2 1 2 1. Right, nice. We're going live from 5 minutes again. How is that now, Marlon? My brother Marlon, how is that? All right. So I want to say good evening to everybody. Good evening to all who are watching. And if this is your first time to the show, welcome to Lightning and Thunder. All right, Lightning and Thunder. On a Wednesday, 8:30 p.m. is where we start. We normally go from 8:30 to 9. Sometimes we go a little over, like how we went over last week, all right? But nevertheless, 8:30, and of course we give a little 10 minutes to build up the lives, all right? So we could say 8:40 is when you're definitely inside. But I want to acknowledge all those who were here from 8:30. Last week we spoke about all things horn. That was episode 2 from week 1, episode 1. And what we will be doing is that we will have that topic, and every week we'll have a part 1 and a part 2. Episode 1, episode 2, all right? And this evening we are talking about fantasies. That is what we're talking about. Fantasy. Fantasy is a big word. So this is episode 1, part 1 of fantasy. And what we normally do, we start to acknowledge a few of those who are already inside, sitting down, waiting. Maybe you're relaxing and you just enjoying the moment. This evening we are speaking boldly. Things that some of us may not want to talk about or we have hidden inside. We will be talking about that this evening, all right? First of all, let me say good evening to Marlon, Cornell Marlon. Good afternoon to Malu, my brother Malu. Good evening to you. Samantha, good evening, Samantha. How are you, Samantha? Nigel, good evening to you, Nigel. Gia, oh God, Miss Paul, blessed to have you inside. Miss Paul, Gia always bring some very interesting and very open-minded, if I mind judge, very open comments, and we appreciate that very much, Miss Paul, very much. Samantha, good evening. Natasha, good evening. Nigel, good evening. Nicole Dikoto, welcome. I'm glad to have you inside. June Batiste, good evening to you. Sharon Williams, good evening to you. Sharon, welcome inside, Sharon. Junior, hi to you as well, Junior. Lynn, good evening to you, Lynn. Stacy Ann, good evening to you, Stacy Ann. James Paul, yes, it's a love. Your comments are well appreciated indeed. All right, so this evening we are talking fantasy. Now, how many of us are afraid to admit that we have a fantasy? How many of us are afraid to say, I have a fantasy and I would like to live out my fantasy? How many of us? How many of us, we are big people, we are adults, we are over 18, we are consulting adults, but in your mind, you have a thought about something that you fantasize about inside in that quiet moment. You've been fantasizing about this and saying, oh my, if I could only live this, if I could only experience this, if I could only just for one night do something like this that I have dreamt about. Some of us, we take it and we put it down in a space that is so deep within our inner soul that we hide it away and pretend like that fantasy does not exist. But the fantasy is there. You live your entire life until you reach an age where it is impossible to even live that fantasy. Now that fantasy could be anything. That fantasy, you may have a fantasy of jumping out of a plane and parachuting. You may have a fantasy of going to a river, or you may have a fantasy of scuba diving. Fantasy is a broad word. Fantasy is something that you dreamt about. Something that you would like to do and fantasize about, and telling yourself that you may not experience that, so you live that fantasy out in your dreams, in your nights, in times of when you're by yourself and you want to live that fantasy. So I am challenging a lot of you all this evening. What is your fantasy? This is Lightning and Thunder, and this evening, fantasy. All right, let's share about what are some of your fantasies. All right, let's open the discussion here. Stacy and Natasha is saying, my fantasy has always been about eating ice cream on a rainy day, and the ice cream is bitterly cold and I get brain freeze. That's a simple fantasy. These things can happen. And these things, I'm reading my messages, and my messages are telling me this. Stacy and Kellyanne, good evening. All right. Rosie, good evening to you, Rosie. Marlo, good evening to you, Marlo. Good evening, my friend, the doctor. Good evening, Rosie. Miss Paul is saying, to most people, fantasizing is a taboo. That's what she's saying. Fantasizing is a taboo. All right? What is a taboo? Would you tell your partner what you fantasize about? Would you tell and be honest to yourself that I am going to live out my fantasy? Are you willing enough or brave enough to at least try to live out your fantasy? Do you have that strength inside to tell your partner what is your fantasy? Good evening to you, Anderson, Alexander, Paiman. Good evening to you, Paiman. Paiman, you may have a fantasy, Paiman. I don't know if you're living out your fantasy, Paiman. Marlo is saying, here one of my fantasies is owning an island in the Maltese and living there with my son and my significant other with no stress. You see? That is what a fantasy. A fantasy could be anything. Anything a fantasy could be. Anything. So Marlo fantasy here is owning an island. Marlo, how possible you think it is owning an island? It's a fantasy. You may tell yourself that you may not accomplish owning an island in this lifetime. But some of us, you may never know if you work hard enough to achieve your fantasy, it may come true. True love is my fantasy. This is coming from Stone Cold Andrews. True love is my fantasy. We have to be brave enough to understand, first of all, acknowledge that we have fantasies, all right? And secondly, we have to understand what is the limits of our fantasy. Is our fantasy, can we make our fantasy come to life? Can we do what we fantasize about? Some of us have a fantasy and we fantasize on owning a sports car, owning something that is exotic. A fantasy could be anything. A fantasy could be of an intimate moment. So what is your fantasy? Let's broad and let's talk about what is your fantasy. Jacqueline, hi, good evening to you, Jacqueline, Miss Eligo. Eligo, yes, good evening to you, Miss Eligo. Eligo, what we got? Pie in the house, and it ain't easy to talk about lightning and thunder, your fantasy. So Paiman is saying it's not easy to talk about your fantasy to your partner. How many of us have that belly to admit first to ourselves, like I said before, that we have a fantasy? And secondly, how many of us have that confidence level to say, this is what it is, without your partner shunning on you? For an intimate fantasy, for an exclusive fantasy. And like I mentioned before, fantasy could be anything. A thought of the mind, what you wear. Ladies, are you willing enough to listen to your male partner to hear what is his fantasies? And guys, are you willing enough to listen to your female partner and hear what is her fantasy, or whatever your partner is, whoever your partner is? Are you willing enough to listen and at least hear without judging? Now, judging is a serious thing. One will be afraid to tell their partner about a fantasy they have because they are afraid of being judged. Or maybe they might say, well, my partner may look at me different from that going forward. And then you meet somebody on the outside who is now willing to make your fantasy come true, whatever your fantasy is. And that door is open now because somebody on the outside is willing to make your fantasy come true. Good evening to you, Michelle. Marlo is saying, I had another fantasy which I worked towards making come true, and I made them reality, and it felt great and fulfilling when I lived it. Marlo, how did that really feel? You said it felt great when you lived it. Sometimes you may tell yourself that this fantasy may not happen, and you make another fantasy. Nothing is wrong in having multiple fantasies. The idea is that when you experience the fantasy that you dreamt about since for how long, and you experience that fantasy feeling is overwhelming to you in a joyful way, because you accomplished something that you thought you would have never accomplished. You fantasize about this over and over. I want to make it very clear that a fantasy could be anything. You can fantasize about anything visually, all right? People are married, people have their spouse, their better half, so to speak, and afraid because of the judging. And they go outside and they experience their inner fantasy, whatever it may be, and somebody on the outside is making that fantasy come true. What do you think will happen to you inside? That the inner home, your partner come home, will he tell you that I live in another fantasy outside? Do you think he's going to stop, he or she is going to stop having that fantasy world that they live in, that they're making happen? Stop that. They're not going to stop that. They're going to continue having that fantasy. That is something that they fantasize about all their life, and someone else is making it happen. So I mentioned in the last episode that communication is the key in a relationship. It all goes back to this as well. You need to be sure of yourself and your partner to have that confidence to discuss your fantasies. Auntie Betty, fantasy think it's all in the mind like a dream. Auntie Betty is saying fantasy, she think it's all in the mind like a dream. Well, that's what we fantasize. Fantasy first lives in your mind. It develops a thought and develops in your mind. And these are the things that we fantasize about. I'm getting some messages here. Let me see my WhatsApp. Remember, you can also WhatsApp me at 755-8055. Okay, so I'm going to here. Soca Man, a nice laid out on house on the intercoastal with an infinity pool, and 39-footer fisherman, a triple 400 Mercury Verado on the back, an LS 500 and a range in the garage. This is Soca Man. Good evening to you, Soca Man. This is his fantasy. And Soca Man, if you work towards that particular fantasy, you can achieve that fantasy. I fantasize about, this is Malo saying he's fantasized about visiting Caribbean islands, and I made them come through, vacationing at Barbados, Jamaica, St. Lucia, twice Antigua and Margarita, and bro, it felt great achieving that. And that inner feeling when you make your fantasy come true. Now visual, Auntie Betty is saying that it's all in your mind. Visual is good, and it may not happen sometimes that way, that you may not see visually, but you can make it happen. You lie down, you dream about, you fantasize about things in your mind. Visual stimulation is what you're actually looking for, you know. That sense of achievement, that you achieve something that you fantasize about. All right, you can WhatsApp me at 755-8055. You can voice note as well, 755-8055. You can also call in, yes, 7558055 number on the screen. All right. Stacey is saying that my fantasy has always been to go on a roller coaster with my loved one and kiss him while we are going up and down the slopes. Now you see, that's a fantasy. You can imagine that you're on a roller coaster and you kissing your loved one on this roller coaster. How possible is it to make that fantasy come true? Well, we don't have any Coney Islands like we had before, so we don't really have any roller coasters, you know. But are you brave enough to tell your partner that you want to go on a roller coaster and give him a kiss while you're on the slopes? So the point of it is that we have to be brave enough to tell our partner what we fantasize about. Now, if you're not involved with someone, you can have your own fantasy for your own self that does not involve someone else, you know. Like I said before, fantasy is an achievement of something that you dream about, you fantasize about it, and wishing that this could happen. And you're telling yourself that you don't have the confidence enough to make it happen. So you fantasize about it and telling yourself that this may be the closest you can get to make that fantasy come true by dreaming about it, imagining about it. All right. Good evening to you, my brother RKG. Yes, RKG. That's our brother. That's our brother from long time on. RKG. Good evening to you, RKG. Veronica. Good evening to you, Veronica. Karen. Good evening to you, Karen. Keith. Good evening to you, Keith. Kellyanne is saying, Dr. Ross, my fantasy has always been to eat wild meat on a river, paddling on a boat. Well, that could happen. What is stopping you from making that fantasy come true? Eating wild meat on a river, paddling on a boat. You can put things in place. I'm sure you could. How many of us ever visited the Caroni Swamp? We could go on a tour. I mean, right now with how the COVID restrictions are now, with the lockdown and rollback of restrictions, so to speak, river courses and beaches are closed at this point in time. But in time to come, you can make that fantasy come true. Wait till it's wild meat season, hunting season is open. Get your wild meat. Organize to make a boat tour and go. You want to paddle, and you could talk to the operator of the vessel and say, this is your fantasy. And this is it. You need to talk. And stroll down that river and make your fantasy come true. How many of us are putting things in place to make our fantasy come true? Fantasies are visual. Lizelle, good evening to you. Lizelle. Veronica, good evening to you, Veronica. Stacy is saying, and she's saying that Dr. Ross, I love your voice, and sometimes I fantasize about you. Well, that by itself is a fantasy. Nothing is wrong in fantasizing in someone. Once, you know. Dresy saying, yes indeed. Soca Man Notorious B.I.G. said it was all a dream, and that dream sure came through. It sure came true. Yes. And it starts with a dream. We all fantasize from time to time, and we all must first overcome that hurdle of confidence. You need to have confidence enough to say that I am going to live my fantasy. Don't wait until you reach a particular age and say, I wish I shoulda, coulda, woulda done this. And then you can't. You need to understand if that is your fantasy and you want to make it happen. Try to make it happen. Once it's within the legal limits. Alright? And consenting limits as well. Miss Paul, that roller coaster kiss would be real vibes though. Yes, Miss Paul, I agree with you. Imagine you're on that roller coaster and you're going up the slide, as she said, that's her fantasy, and coming down and you're kissing your better half and you're getting that G-force going down. Yes. Rosie is saying, what Rosie is saying here? I fantasize all the time in winning the lotto. Who's saying this here? June is Rosie, okay. June is saying that. And that's a fantasy. If you continue playing the lotto, then you could, one day, you never know your luck. The fantasy may come true. Rosie, me, myself, I want to hit 5 of the lotto. Okay. Lizelle Peters, good night. Yes, good evening to you. Lizelle, Miss Peters, good evening to you. Angela, good evening to you. Angela. You're inside Lightning and Thunder if you have just to join us, where we speak about things and we talk about different topics every week, and you give your view and share your view with your comments, and we interact and learn something that we may not have learned before. We learn something. Leanne King is saying, good night, my fantasy is to make love every night. As a fantasy that if you believe you can make love every night, then go right ahead, Leanne. Leanne, if your fantasy is making love every night, you go right ahead, sweetheart. Put things in place to organize that, making love every night. If that is what you desire. We are all in charge of ourselves and in charge of our inner being. When you're single, when you're with someone, you and that person communicate and work out to make your fantasy come true. Because we have to admit it, some of us have fantasies before we meet our loved one, before we are in a committed relationship, and we go into that committed relationship with a fantasy in mind, and we shelf it. We shelf that fantasy because we tell ourselves that our partner is not willing enough to do the fantasy. And again, you go outside and you, whatever the fantasy is, and you experience it with another person because you are afraid to talk to your partner about that fantasy. Communicate indeed. Paiman is saying, when you fantasize is a hope that what in the mind can come through like a dream. And Paiman, you're correct. Paiman, you are correct, Anderson. When you fantasize is a hope that you can make it come true. And how many of us can safely say that I have made my dreams come true? Are you really trying to make your dreams come true, or you shelf it and say that it will never happen? That will never happen, because in your mind you think about it, it's not happening, you play behind the corridor, you're working today, you're studying the day-to-day bills, and time passes. And we get older, more mature, and then we reach an age that we cannot live that fantasy. And we cannot live it. While time is on your side, depends on your fantasy, because you're not going to be 80-something and want to go on the roller coaster, and while you're coming over that slope, a heart attack because the G-force and the kiss and the adrenaline, and So we have to make time to actually make time for ourselves and enjoy that fantasy. The first thing to do, if you're involved with someone, talk to that person. Be brave enough to talk to that person. Comfortable enough to say, all right, take for instance, the guys. Let's touch on the guys first, all right? Some men would love to see and fantasize that their women or the woman, let me make me very clear, the better half, wear something seductive. They would wear a lingerie. They would wear an outfit. They fantasize about their better half coming into bed wearing something sexy. Do a little dance, do a little something fun, romantic, arouse their mental. Some men fantasize about that, but they never tell their better half what they want. So they live with a restriction, a door, a fantasy that is deep down inside, boggled down. And they would find, does this happen like we talked about horn last week, so those who are inside with horn would understand what I'm saying. They would find someone on the outside to fulfill their fantasies. So just as that, and women sometimes fantasize about certain things, intimate and otherwise, and they are very much afraid to tell their partner what their fantasy is, because it goes right back. The fear of being judged. The fear of being judged if your fantasy is something that you think your partner may find it awkward. Alright? Alright, let's see what we have. That fantasy I can do with that. Sexy lingerie is a fantasy of mine. Rosie's saying that is a great fantasy. Juliana, welcome Juliana. Good evening to you, Juliana. Yes, sweetheart, good evening to you. And it comes back to communication, it comes right back to communication. That is the key. Now, what I have to say here, I'm going through your messages here, all right? Dr. Ross, this one is very interesting here. I want to share this one. Dr. Ross, I share my fantasy with my best friend. He has been my best friend for many years, and I could never tell my husband what is my fantasy. And my best friend, who held my secret, fulfilled my fantasy. I'll stop it right there, right? She spoke to her best friend, who is a male. She didn't have the confidence enough because of judgmental. She may tell herself how her husband would look at her tomorrow to live out that fantasy, and her best friend lived the fantasy out. While you don't know if you and your husband could have taken that fantasy to a different level and enjoy that fantasy. But the fear of going to your husband and telling him that, it didn't say what your fantasy was, but telling him that this is what I want done, stopped you from experiencing that fantasy with your married husband because of the fear. You will always have that in your mind from time to time, that you live your fantasy, but you fulfill that fantasy with someone else beside your loved one. All right? You got to be brave enough. We got to be brave enough to say what is our fantasy. Hi, Dr. Ross. My fantasy is catching a great white shark. I hope one day I can fish and go out there and catch a great white shark. That's a good fantasy. If you're a fisherman and your dream, you fantasize about catching a great white shark, try and try and try again. You cannot stay on the shore or stay home and say, I'm going to catch the great white shark one day. You have to go out there to put your things in place and put yourself in position to catch that great white shark, if that is your fantasy, and make your fantasy come true. Too many of us are reaching that golden age and wondering a woulda, shoulda, coulda, and not really enjoying life. We need to stop and enjoy life. Hi, Dr. Ross. I fantasize that my boyfriend would lose some weight and go to the gym. All right. Have you spoken to your boyfriend about losing the weight? Have you spoken to your boyfriend about going to the gym and toning up because you fantasize of being with someone with muscles and this and that and a well-toned body? But have you spoken to him to actually make that fantasy come true? Paiman is saying, there are people you see sometimes and feel every time you see them, you can have them, and you end up like super blue. I wish I could have and could have that. All right. This is what Paiman is saying. I'm just reading his message there. So Paiman is saying that there are people you see sometimes and feel every time you see them, you can have them. That's a mental fantasy. That means that in your inner thought, in my opinion, your inner thought while growing up, you are looking for something particular. Something switches on that switch in you, and you fantasize. So he's saying that sometimes you sometimes and feel every time you see them, you can have them. But okay, let's just say Paiman is one person you're talking to, all right? Are you brave enough to go to that individual and tell that individual how you feel? It all depends on how you put it over, without trying to be too rude or too out of place. Sometimes it's not what you do, is how you do it. Women are very approachable once you know how to approach. If you approach in the wrong way, you could never go further than that because your approach was wrong. And some of us, we lack that approach. Some men. Sokaman is saying, last week someone said that in a relationship, no conversation is off limits. That is true, Sokaman. Someone said last week that no conversation is off limits, and that is right. It goes back to being open with your partner. A fantasy could be anything. It does not have to be intimate. A fantasy, as we're learning here, could be anything. But what we have learned so far is that fantasy is first a thought in your mind. And the expression of the fantasy is visual. Alright? Miss Paul, fear not thy judgment. Be bold with your fantasies is the key to making them a reality. And Miss Paul, you're right. You are right. We have to take that bold step in saying that I want to experience this. Alright? Good evening to you, Dr. Ross. I would love very much to tell my wife how I feel. I would like to have relations with 2 and 3 women at the same time. How brave enough? How brave, partner? Let me talk about this. How brave enough are you to tell your better half that you want to experience a sexual encounter with 2 and 3 ladies at the same time? How many men have that fantasies? How many women have that fantasies? But it goes right back to what I'm saying. The fear of that judging, being judged, is what having you being afraid to talk to your partner. We have to overcome that fear. And the only way to overcome that fear is communication between you and your partner, and enjoying that moment where you're so comfortable that both of you all could talk about anything. And as I said before earlier in the conversation, you go into a relationship with fantasies already. It's obvious your partner have also fantasies. You may think that he or she may not have fantasies, but they have. But you just cage it down inside because of the fear of being judged. Oh, I want to say good evening to Lemoy. Lemoy, good evening to you, Lemoy. It's a pleasure having you inside Lightning and Thunder. Every Wednesday from 8:30 we discuss matters. And, it's a pleasure to have you on board, Lemoy. Pleasure indeed, Lemoy. Leanne King is saying, Dr. Ross, what is your fantasy? Lemoy? I say Lemoy. Leanne King. Leanne, Dr. Ross, what is your fantasy? Alright, let me tell you what my fantasy is. I will discuss my fantasy as we get closer to the end, alright? But tell a friend what takes place every Wednesday from 8:30. We just do 1 hour. It's Thunder, Lightning and Thunder, where we discuss issues. This evening is episode 1, right? I will keep repeating, I'm telling you so you can get familiar, to tell a friend that we do 2 topics per month, part 1 and part 2, alright? The first edition was Horn, part 1 and part 2, and there now we have Fantasy, part 1. So next week Wednesday would be part 2 of Fantasy. Now remember, you can also WhatsApp me, send me a voice note. You can also call in live, 755-8055. That's my number if you want to have a discussion and share some of your thoughts. Miss King, I am going to tell you what is my fantasy before I end this evening, Lightning and Thunder, alright? Andrews is saying the gentleman is a long time thing. It's yes. What we got? Ooh. For me is Destra and Angela. If I was to ever be with two, Destra and Angela. Which Angela? Miss Paul say, she's wishing him all the best. Yes, Miss Paul. Anderson Alexander, well boy, I am brave enough to ask that I tried that already and it was successful. Well, you see, Anderson is saying that he tried that already and he was successful. So he was brave enough to ask his partner that I want to have a sexual encounter with 3 ladies at the same time. And he said he was very successful because he was brave. Now, Anderson, let me ask you this, Anderson. Is that your special person you're with right now? Or that was somebody before? Or that was somebody out of your relationship? What is that? Let me know. Lightning and Thunder with Dr. Ross. I want to say good evening to my brother, Mr. Ken Simmons. Good evening to Ken Simmons. Ken Simmons, very good brother. Now you need to listen to IRN on a Sunday. Ken Simmons, he does IRN on a Sunday, which is a reggae program, and trust me, the reggae program is out of this world. It's on Vibe City 105 FM. He has it on his Facebook page. Large him up, man, and continue to do all those things, my brother Ken Simmons, man. One of these good evening, Ken Simmons. We will have Ken Simmons inside and we will banter something and some good points. Looking forward to that, Ken Simmons. Kitty Shyla, good evening to you, Kitty. Welcome aboard, Shyla. This evening we are talking fantasies. Are you brave enough to talk to your partner to make fantasies come true? We need to take that. What is your fantasy? How many of you all are willing to share some of your fantasies with me this evening here so we can discuss that? But like I said, do not wait until you reach an age where you cannot live out your fantasy. Do not carry down yourself and tell yourself that your fantasy is too unrealistic to happen. If you find your fantasy is going to the moon and you know you cannot go to the moon, are you going to at least try to go to the moon? Jump on a plane, go and do a space program, do whatever it is, do a virtual something. Something can happen, at least you can get close enough to your fantasy. Again, fantasies are not only about sexual encounter. A fantasy could be anything. We all have fantasies. What are we doing to make our fantasies come true? Ken Simmons, my brother. Yes, my brother. Bassett. Oh, Angela Bassett. Soca man. Yes, Sergeant Devine. Soca man. Angela Bassett, boy. What a fantasy. Some of us are afraid of loving ourselves. We must never be afraid to love ourselves. If you cannot love yourself, you cannot love anybody. How many of us know what love is? Alright, now we will discuss love at a later time. But love has a big role to do with fantasy. Alright? Are we taking that measure to make that fantasy come true? And my point this evening here, as we are talking fantasy, is do not sit down on your royals and lock away your fantasy. If you truly want your fantasy to live out, you have to work towards making it happen. And if you are involved in with someone, you must be brave enough. Communication level must be on a level where you all are openly speaking and you can talk about anything like we discussed last week. All right, Judy, good evening to you, Judy. Deborah is saying, on the flip side, one may want to be open about their fantasies with their spouse. All right, let's come back to Deborah. Let's take a call. All right. Hello, welcome to Lightning and Thunder. Good evening.
Good evening, Dr. Ross. How are you?
Hi, good evening, sweetheart. How are you? I am good. I am great. You know, we're battling everything.
I would like to share something with your viewers. My husband, a year ago, he asked me, he told me that he wants to see other people. I told him I don't agree with it. But then he told me that it is fancy to be with other women.
He wants to be with other women?
Yes, he told me that, Dr. Ross. And what I did was, I told him, bring the woman you want to be with. And I let him. He came to me, I did not judge him. And he had the woman in the house. And I was there and I watched them. I sit down and I watched everything in front of my face.
All right. Hold on, sweetheart. Hold on. No, you don't have to give me your name, all right? But let's just call you. Let's just call you what? Lisa? Let's call you Lisa. Let me ask you this, caller. You're telling me that are you, first of all, are you still with this person?
Of course, that is my husband for 30
It's your
years,
husband.
Dr. Ross.
How many years you're married?
30 years.
20 years it's your husband. And he wanted to have sexual encounter with other women in front of you?
No, he wanted to have another relationship, and he said that it is his fantasy to have sex with someone else. And I said, that is not a problem.
Wow.
Talk about it, because I don't want to lose my husband to go out there. I want to know what's going on, because we are best friends.
Okay.
And he brought them over, and I sit down and I watched and I participate.
So you watch your husband make love to these women and you participated too as well?
Of course. And our marriage is stronger than ever.
You see, and he will not go out and horn you because he was brave enough to come out and tell you that this is what he wanted to do. You were accepting enough to accept the fact that this is what your husband wanted to do and allow it to happen.
I understand how life is. Life is not, you can't be selfish, because if I say no to him, he will still do it. So do it for me.
You're right.
You understand, Dr. Ross? So I put on a nice lacy lingerie and we had fun. It was wonderful.
You put on your lingerie and you joined in on the action?
It was wonderful.
I must tell you.
I never regret it. But doctor, I just shared this with you so you will understand that, you know, we have people, we live different lives, we do different things, but communication is most important. So you have a good evening.
Thank you, caller. Thank you very much for sharing your experience about that. Thank you very much. And 7558055 as the caller just said, and let me touch on what she said for some of you all who may not understand or maybe was not hearing exactly what she was saying. She was saying that her better half came to her and wanted to have relations with other women. And she was open-minded enough to say yes and make his fantasies come true. They came, she sat, she watched, she said that she even put on a lingerie and joined in. And today they are married for 20 years and the marriage is healthy. There's no horning taking place. There's nothing. Their marriage is so pure and open that there's no room for horn. He has no reason to go to do nothing because his wife and both of them are making their inner fantasies come true, and it strengthens the relationship. Some of us may look at it as a negative, that now we're talking fantasies of an intimate relation. Huh? This is what we're talking about here right now, right? And the callers rightfully said that their marriage is happy, and they are happy 20 years now they are married, and she made her husband's dreams come true by having that. How many women are willing to do what that caller just said? Say for instance that guys, let me touch you guys. Let me touch you guys here. Fellas, if your lady, your better half, she comes to you and say, listen baby, I fantasize about being with two men at the same time. You as a man, will you be accepting enough to say yes baby and watch another man make love to your wife? And as your wife fantasy, you're making her happy. Would you be brave enough to do that, to watch her make love to someone else? Well, both of you all. Or would you just say, or shun on that, and she'll go outside and make love to two men at the same time because she wants to live her fantasy? First and foremost, your fantasy of that nature has to be open enough that it can happen home. Happen home first. Open enough to talk and make your fantasies happen home first. If you're single and you want to make your single fantasies come true, you have nobody to answer to but yourself. And if that is what you want to do, Go right ahead and put things in place to make your fantasy come true. Don't wait, again as saying it, don't wait till you reach a age that you cannot live out your fantasy. Think about it. Anderson is saying that was one of Piper earlier girlfriend, and she set it up with someone of her other girlfriend. So he's saying that was one of his earlier girlfriends, and she made that come true. She set it up with some of her girlfriends and made his fantasy come true. And so Anderson, are you satisfied now that your fantasy was fulfilled? Are you satisfied now with your fantasy being fulfilled? Or you would like to experience that fantasy again, or maybe add on to it with your present partner? Anderson. Vanessa, good evening to you, Vanessa. Chanel Davis, good evening to you. Maria, good evening to you, Maria. Sandra, good evening to you, Sandra. Abigail, good evening to you, Abigail. Listra, good evening to you, Listra. Kellyanne, good evening to you, Kellyanne. Belinda, good evening to you, Belinda. Welcome. What we got? Miss Paul, she's saying exactly 100. Men could give, they can't take. But Miss Paul, it all depends on the communication you have with your better half. Now, men innately macho. We macho. Men, a lot of men, very macho. And it make it even worse if the man, your better half, your male partner, agrees to a threesome with someone else. And then now, we men macho. And the man come now and ting, and you realize now, the man have a bigger container than he. A bigger truck. In that man, he wouldn't talk it, but he would say, "Oh good, I want to have a big truck, boy." And then, how would he feel seeing that big truck reversing into your wife's container and pulling that container? This is why communication. Sit down and talk to your partner, and you'll understand where the boundaries are, where the limits are. Have a safe word. Know the person that you're going to make that with, if that is your fantasy. Know exactly where that trust is. Be safe. Get the test done. There are measures to get your fantasy. So what is your fantasy? Men could give, but they cannot take. Men only talking. Some men only talk. But when it comes to action, they're backing out. And that is why a lot of men get horned. And that is why the outside man is sweeter than your own husband. Because they are willing to do things that your husband is not willing to do. Alright, we have to face it. Why is that happening? It's because you are being more openly with the outside man. If you have an outside man, right? Let me just say you have an outside man. Let's talk about this situation. You have an outside man. The things you're doing with your outside man, you're not doing with your husband. We're just saying for saying sake, for argument's sake, that you have an outside man. You more openly with your outside man than your own husband, because you're telling yourself that you will never be judged. See, that word judge is one of the biggest fears if you're having a fantasy of an intimate relation, so to speak, and your fear of being judged. You're open to that, and you're telling yourself that my husband or my wife will never understand, and that's why you continue outside doing what you're doing. You don't know that how many of us don't even know that the fantasy you may have is the same fantasy that your partner have, but you don't know because you never talk. You keep it bottled down. You keep it inside. Rosie is saying that she cannot grow that guts, but she needs guts to do that. Well, that's what the fantasy may be. Think about your fantasy. This is my fantasy, Dr. Ross. I want to play on a Thursday on 105. The Ambassador live on 105. Retro Thursday is one of my fantasies, to be a DJ on 105. And this is from Stone Cold Andrews. Stone Cold Andrews, if that is your fantasy and you want to play on Retro Thursday on the #1 radio station 105 FM, and that is your fantasy, what steps are you taking to get that opportunity to make a guest appearance on 105 to live your fantasy Stone Cold Andrews? Have you ever picked up the phone and called 105 FM or maybe the program director or someone in upper management to say, listen, my fantasy, and explain what your fantasy is. I just want to have a guest appearance maybe for an hour or half an hour on 105 FM on a retro Thursday, and that is my fantasy. So, Stone Cold Andrews, have you done that? Have you take steps to make your fantasy on playing on 105 FM retro Thursday come true? How many DJs has the fantasy? But Stone Cold, if you sit down and say that is my fantasy and it will never happen because you never take steps in making it happen, you don't know if today or tomorrow you can fulfill your fantasies and play on 105 FM on retro Thursday as a guest. So you never know. Put steps in place in making your fantasies come true. What is your fantasy? Your fantasy could be anything. Hi, good evening to you, Dr. Ross. One of my fantasies, I met you in a party and I wanted to come and dance with you. You passed by me and I don't know what cologne you were wearing, but I fell in love with you and my fantasy was just to dance with you and smell you. All right. Did you ask me to dance? Did you come to me and ask me for a dance? All right, I passed you. You enjoyed the something about my cologne triggered something in you, sweetheart. But my point here is, did you take steps to make your fantasy come true? Did you? If we don't get up to make our fantasies come true, it will never happen. Miss Paul. Good evening, Miss Paul. What is your fantasy? I find you're inside plenty. What is your fantasy, Miss Paul? What is your fantasy? What is your fantasy? Jillian. Good evening, Dr. Ross. I enjoy your program so much on radio and I'm totally enjoying your stream and I can't wait. I never knew you had a show on a Wednesday. I am not missing it now. Thank you very much, Jillian. Thank you very much. Soca Man is asking, Sajilevine is asking Gia if she tried it. Miss Paul, you tried it? Claudius Stewart, good evening to you, Claudius. Maria, good evening to you. Maria. Sandra Pascal, good evening to you, Sandra. Yes, you are right, Dr. Ross. It all comes right back to communication. We have to share our fantasies more often with our significant others and stop keeping it bottled up inside. Whoa, okay, Shajan Levine. Soca Man is saying, folks, this might be a fantasy, but I wish Trinidad and Tobago could get back to the days of pre-internet and cable TV, where we did not have that outside influence that I believe is responsible for the carnage taking place today. All right. So come on, let me elaborate on this here and talk about your fantasy. All right, your fantasy is you wish Trinidad and Tobago could get back to the days of pre-internet. Now, we need to go forward. As a nation, as a society, we cannot stay stagnant with technology. So we have to continue developing new technology. The problem is not technology. The problem is what we do with the technology, all right? Now, you want to go back of pre-internet and cable TV because you believe cable TV is influencing and is responsible for the carnage taking place today. Let me tell you something. Before it had television and internet, it had carnage. In the beginning of time, it had violence, it had murder. I want to go for, let's talk about, look at Cain and Abel. It didn't have no internet or TV or cable in the days of Cain and Abel, but there was murder. So to say that internet and TV and cable is causing the carnage and thing nowadays, I disagree with that part, all right? Because that has been around before internet and TV and cable, all right? The gladiator days, the Roman days. If you look at history with the Egyptian, you go back in history, there have always been and has always been carnage. All right, but I understand your fantasy, all right, and I respect your fantasy. People should not be judged Dr. Ross, I would love to tell my better half how I feel about his brother. I fantasize about my better half brother on many occasions. Sometimes I make the mistake and calling my husband his brother name. Alright, some women, she's saying here that she fantasizes about her husband's brother. That's a fantasy. Or if you find that that is your fantasy and that's what you want to make happen, two things can happen. If you want to sleep with your brother, your brother-in-law, so to speak, right? Your brother-in-law. One, you may tell yourself you cannot talk to your husband about that because that may not happen. You might want to go behind his back and sleep with your husband, brother, or your brother-in-law. What you could do, if you really want that to happen, two things need to happen. One, you need, and this is the two things that need to happen in my opinion. One, you need to talk to your brother-in-law, lay your cards on the table, and two, you need to divorce your husband. If you cannot talk to your husband about that, all right, now what you may think is wrong, but a fantasy, there are no limits to fantasies. Huh? Right is right and wrong is wrong. It all depends on your morals and what you think is right and wrong. Rules. But I believe if you're fantasizing about your brother-in-law, you need to divorce your husband so your husband will no longer be your partner and your brother-in-law will no longer be your brother-in-law. And then now you now make a move on him because he's no longer your brother-in-law. He's an individual. Alright? But you cannot, in my opinion, rightfully decide to get your husband a horn with your brother just so. Because that's something will never stop. Your brother will always be wrong. Your brother-in-law, so to speak, your brother-in-law. And your husband, brother, he are wrong. And all of a sudden your husband find your brother stopping by too much. So if that's your fantasy, you can put things in place. Divorce your husband. And you no longer your brother-in-law. Alright? What we have here. Hey, DJ Wiz, good afternoon to you, Wiz. He's saying, Dr. Ross, this program could cause some trouble. I love it. Yes, Wiz. Wiz, what happened is that on a Wednesday from 8:30 to 9:30, 1 hour of lightning and thunder, we discuss issues. All right? So you can tell a friend what takes place on a Wednesday. Tonight's topic is fantasy. We are talking about fantasies. What are your fantasies? Are you putting things in place to make your fantasy come true? All right? Welcome aboard, Wiz. Welcome aboard. Ms. Paul saying beers is a sure way to grow guts. Literally. I don't need beers to be brave though. So what she's saying is there, what Ms. Paul, what she's saying is that get intoxicated enough to build encouragement to tell your partner what is your fantasies. She's saying beers is a way to grow guts. Alright? Sharing that there. Claudius, good evening to you, Claudius. Samantha, what's your fantasy, Samantha? What is your fantasy? What do we grow? Earlier on, we heard a caller said that she made her husband 20 years now. Fantasies came true because he wanted to sleep with other women, and she allowed it, and she partaked, and she joined in, and she put on a nice lingerie, and she did a little dance, and she pleased him and things like that, and they're happy. Hi, Dr. Ross. Now remember, you can watch me also on YouTube. DJ Dr. Ross on my channel, DJ Dr. Ross. I'm streaming live as well from YouTube and on Facebook. Next week we'll be on Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook. All right. So I'm taking messages both from Facebook and YouTube right now. All right. So Giselle is saying good evening. Point 14. Hi, Point 14. Yes, Wiz is inside. Point 14 is inside. Sandra Pascal. Good evening to you, Sandra. Jonathan saying, I told my girlfriend my fantasy and she made it come true. You just have to know the correct timing. She never once threw it back in my face and I love her even more. I believe sharing your fantasies with your partner makes your relationship stronger. And that is exactly what I was saying early on. If you're brave enough to share your fantasies with your partner, your relationship would move to a different level. It will strengthen enough. You do not need to hide and lie or horn, because you're all open, you're all speaking what's on your mind. You're all sharing that. All right? All right. So Kaman is saying, Dr. Ross, point taken, but we have gotten much uglier than we were, and it's not getting better. I am not saying we should go backwards by any means. Understand what you're saying, so Kaman? But I don't think internet and TV is the main reason for that. It may be influencing to a point because a lot of us see movies and we fantasize about what we saw on the movie. Alright? Alright. We're growing up, we see cartoons, we see superheroes. Take for instance, Superman and Wonder Woman. How much fellas believe they could have been Superman and have X-ray vision and could fly? How much women believe they could be a Wonder Woman and fantasize about being that and go to sleep and you have a nice dream and all these things because we fantasize based on what we see and we want to experience that, because it's an experience that we want to feel. We want to experience something that we tell ourselves that we may never experience in life. We just want to know how it feels. Right? Giselle is saying, good evening to you, Dr. Ross. Totally enjoy your program every day on 105. I'm looking forward to Thunder Tiles tomorrow. Can I send my song here? You can send it to me tomorrow, sweetheart, all right? On air, when I'm on air, not a problem. What we got? Anderson is saying, she have to take that brother-in-law fantasy out of her mind. That will cause some trouble. But Anderson, this is her fantasy. And if she wants to sleep with her brother-in-law, I just told her my suggestion, within my opinion, if you fantasize about being with your brother-in-law, that means that you have a feeling for your brother-in-law. First thing you need to do is to talk to your brother-in-law, because you don't want to divorce your husband and your brother-in-law don't want you. Talk. Don't live out your fantasy yet with your brother-in-law. Talk to your brother-in-law and say, listen, this is how I feel. Do you feel that same way? And then you would know if your fantasy can be a reality. If your brother-in-law is involved with somebody, you see where the repercussions going wrong. But if he's not, or he is also willing to divorce his wife, and you're willing to divorce your husband, and no longer you all become an in-law family, and then you can live your fantasies, you can make your fantasy come true. Fantasies could never become reality unless you start to put things in place to make it a reality without hurting your spouse. It all depends on what you're fantasizing. All right? Dr. Ross, one of my fantasies, I would love very much to eat a snow cone in the rain. Come now, that's an easy fantasy. Well, nowadays I don't really see a snow cone man. I don't really see a snow cone man these days. But you can get a snow cone or make your snow cone. When it's raining, go out in the rain and party and enjoy your snow cone in the rain. If your fantasy is going out in the rain and enjoying your snow cone, get a snow cone, go out in the rain and enjoy your snow cone in the rain. But if you don't get a snow cone, rain fall and you just fantasize about having a snow cone in the rain, you're not doing nothing to make your fantasy come true. Tell your partner, if you're involved with someone, and listen, I want to go out in the rain and eat a snow cone. Nothing wrong with that. Share it with your partner. Make your fantasy come true. We don't want to wait until you reach an age where you have arthritis and you can't move, you can't even go in the rain before you get joint pain. And sit down and every time it's raining, you're like, oh gosh, I wish I could have had a snow cone to go out in the rain. Put measures in place to go in the rain and eat your snow cone. Nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that. As Samantha is saying, Dr. Ross, my fantasy is to go and play cricket. Samantha, what steps have you taken to play cricket, Samantha? Samantha, have you picked up a ball, a bat, started to play some wind ball, start to learn to play some cricket, learn the rules of the game, first and things like that? If your fantasy is to go and play cricket, Samantha, What steps are you taking to play cricket, Samantha? Be strong. Be confident. Be confident within your own shoe that, listen, I'm going to play cricket, and even if I get out in the first half or the second or whatever the case might be, you stick to it and you learn and you enjoy playing cricket if cricket is one of your fantasies. Good evening to Jackie Lena. Good evening to Jackie Lena. Good evening to Jackie. Sherry. Good evening to Sherry. Miss Anna, good evening to you, Miss Anna. Rosie, good evening to you. Anderson, once again, Anderson is saying that is his fantasy and he totally enjoyed that. Giselle is saying, Dr. Ross, one of my fantasies growing up is to be a taxi driver. Nothing wrong in being a taxi driver. Again, I am saying it again. If your fantasy is being a taxi driver, then put things in place to be a taxi driver. Go and get your taxi badge and all these things. My point this evening, as we're talking fantasies and we're sharing fantasies, is do not sit down and jail, quarantine your fantasies as just a thought that it may never happen because of the fear of, one, being judged by your partner. Two, you may tell yourself that your fantasies may never happen because you downpour your fantasy and you never get the opportunity to live a fantasy that you want. A lot of us have fantasies. I think nearly everybody have a fantasy, whatever your fantasy may be, visually, verbally, sexually, intimately, physically, whatever your fantasy may be. Are you really taking steps in fulfilling that and making your fantasies come true? Claudia said he could have asked DJ Bravo. Ross, I could remember Stone Cold Andrews for that 105 guest appearance. He well trained. He could recommend. So where's it saying he could recommend Stone Cold for that guest appearance on 105? You see, Stone Cold, again, I want to say this. Your fantasy is you want to make a guest appearance on Retro Thursday. But you're not doing nothing about it. You're sitting down and you're saying that's your fantasy. But are you making phone calls and trying to set up an appointment to say, well, listen, let the program director or let somebody hear you and give you that opportunity to make a guest and to make your fantasy come true? You never know. You may never know, I believe, because right now you don't know if one of our marketing managers, one of our program directors, or who is on our live right now, who is in charge of promotion, may come up with a promotion for amateur DJs to get a spot on a holiday that's coming up. Are we bringing amateur DJs alongside a professional announcer to make your fantasies come true? You don't know if we have someone on our live right now could make your fantasy come true. Stone Cold Andrews. So never give up, put things in place and be brave enough and try to go towards your fantasy. That's our point this evening. Rosie, good evening to you, Rosie. Giselle, I just got a few more minutes inside. But remember, tell a friend and tell a friend every Wednesday from 8:30, Lightning and Thunder with Dr. Ross. We have different topics every Wednesday. Well, part 1 and part 2 to the topic. So tell a friend what takes place. Rosano Daniel on Facebook, DJ Dr. Ross on YouTube, DJ Dr. Ross on Instagram. Like my page. We're going to have some guests we're going to be streaming with and sharing conversation and sharing our stream. I'm also going to open up the share live so you can get in and share your comments and also join my live on the inside. All right. What is Rosie? Rosie, snow cone in the rain. I tell you, but nothing is wrong with having a snow cone in the rain. So once again, I want to thank all of you all for being part of the show this evening. Lightning and Thunder with Dr. Ross. Tell a friend. Next week, Wednesday, we're going to continue Fantasies, part 2. You can watch over the stream on our page and tell a friend and share as much as you want to share. Thank you, everybody, for being part of Lightning and Thunder with Dr. Ross. And as we grow our community, we get bigger and bigger and bigger and better. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. And I want to say good evening to everyone inside. Have a blessed and a safe evening, everyone.